Great, wonderful. Hello, Helena. Thank you so much for making time for us to speak. We've known each other for quite some time now, but it's a great opportunity to have this conversation on the occasion of your wonderful book coming out. So let's dive straight in with a kind of a question to the current affairs, because the 25th conference of the parties on climate change has just ended, and I think we're all desperately disappointed that not very much has happened. And in a way, it's surprising, because we shouldn't be disappointed with it anymore, because after 25 years of nothing happening, one would expect exactly that. But I would love your view on to what extent you've been following what's been going on, and how you see where we got to at the end of this 25th conference with regard to.
Well, I've been saying for quite a while that if we don't help people to focus on the necessity for economic change, I think we're doomed. I am talking to leaders in the business world and in government who believe that they are growing the economy for the voter when they're actually growing it for a global casino economy. And most people are actually becoming poorer, in the sense that they're actually having to work harder and longer just to stay in place. And as people feel squeezed economically and increasingly insecure about their identity, about the future, about their pension, about their children's future, unfortunately, many people are voting for the leaders that stand up and say, we're going to grow the economy, forget about climate, forget about this, forget about the poor. We're going to grow the climate, we're going to grow the economy, make your nation great, and make you rich. So I'm seeing a frightening swing to the right worldwide. I'm seeing leaders who, as I say, actually believe that they're being pressured by the voter to grow the economy. As I see it, both governments and the average citizen are being pressured by deregulated capital, a deregulated casino economy that is pushing more and more, and with bigger and bigger sums of money, in the direction of highly energy intensive, resource intensive growth. So to me, it's about waking up to the need for a new economy movement, and waking up to the fact that it is happening. There is a new economy movement emerging, which I feel extremely hopeful about and very happy to be a part of. And then, of course, I'm encouraging people to engage at the local level to strengthen local economies, particularly around basic needs. And that's also a phenomenon that's growing very rapidly. So I don't feel as depressed and unhappy about Madrid as other people do.
I mean, you've been one of the early voices to say, let's not get distracted with all the other issues. If we have a structurally dysfunctional economic system that is set up in a way that it will transfer money from most of humanity to an ever smaller, ever richer group of very few, and is structurally designed in such a way that it needs losers in order to generate these very few winners, we are making a mistake, and we're getting distracted if we look at all the symptomatic outcomes like climate change, ecosystems collapse, social inequality, rise of right-wing extremism. All of that are ultimately symptoms of an underlying disease, which is a dysfunctional economic system. And certainly for me, 20 years ago, you were one of the first voices with whom I could have not just read the books, but have a wonderful conversation when I was at Schumacher. But what I sense is that conversation is much more mainstream now than it was 20 years ago, and even much more mainstream than it was only 5 years ago. Like like you're also involved with Gaia Education and the Global Eco-Village Network, and when Gaia Education first put out the online curriculum and you helped to write some of it, and that was really radical. People like to say we have a dysfunctional economic system, and really it's all this growth imperative that is underlying all the problems we're facing. People were saying that's a bit of an extremist curriculum, but now I hear people even in the IMF saying that the economic system is disrupted. Even the founder of the World Economic Forum says we need to fundamentally redesign capitalism. So how do you see that square up, that on the one hand, yes, you get some countries like the current American leadership still driving for unbridled economic growth, but I feel more and more countries are starting to talk a different language.
Well, I feel there are definitely more and more leaders, and just recently also from Iceland, Scotland, and New Zealand. And so there is definitely, absolutely, at every level, from the environmental movement, to the social movements, to government level, and at the business level, a recognition something has to change. I think there is still at the top, the higher up you go, the power ladder, and the bigger and fatter salaries that people have, the more power they have, they are not only hampered by what many people will think of almost as some kind of, psychopathic tendencies, and that's how they got into place. I don't see that at all. But what I see is that as you go up the power ladder, you become more and more dependent on second-hand, third-hand, quantified information. You're seeing the world through a grid of numbers. And within the culture of power, the assumption is we've got to continue more or less in the same direction. And there is very little information that is reaching them that really spells out the need actually for decentralization or localization. So that is anathema at that high level. And what I do see is a lot of language about biodiversity, about ecosystems, about rethinking. And I've seen an enormous shift in the language within those corridors of power in the last 30 years. But in actual fact, I see a continuation and a commitment to continuing fundamentally in the same direction. So for me, what's very interesting is, yes, I got invited to speak at the Brussels Economic Forum this year, and got to speak, on the same panel with the head of finance and economics in the EU, and on the same panel with, someone from Unilever, and got to have discussions with the head of the IMF and so on. Last year, I was invited to debate the chief economist of the WTO. And I had Joseph Stiglitz come for tea actually this year also. So I had a lot of discussions with the people who are definitely willing to rethink a bit, but I see a certain fundamentalism in their thinking about what creates growth. And part of that is the conviction that technology creates jobs, the conviction that growth is essential up to a certain point. So far too little concern about what's happened in India and China, where, yes, people have been lifted out of poverty according to those measurements. But when you look at the reality of how they're living in slum-like conditions, often very, very unhealthy, unhealthy just because of the air pollution, but also the quality of the water, the quality of life has plummeted compared to most of the villages that people lived in that were no paradise. But moving into the big cities and being paid some kind of a salary, small or even semi-large, you're still seeing a huge reduction in the quality of life, and nothing that you could really talk about as genuine improvement. And that's something that very few people are actually looking at until now.
Well, this is the other thing, that the conversation around GDP being a desperately inadequate measure of performance of an economy, or certainly of success or progress. We can go into a whole another conversation around this whole progress mindset anyway, but you mentioned two things. You mentioned that the higher level political leaders basically get these summaries that are all focused on quantitative data. That and also you mentioned that while the figures might indicate that people come out of poverty, the quality of their lives, so the qualitative aspect, doesn't actually change positively. And so for me, this is so central to this shift that we need to make now, that we're so stuck on this adage, what gets measured gets managed. And as things get tighter and more problematic, people want to see quicker impact at scale. And so all these knee-jerk responses, like how do we scale it up and how do we measure it and what are the impact indicators? To me, that's driving us all back into a mindset that only looks at the quantifiable, when real quality of life, how we live our lives, how we relate to each other in our communities, how do we relate and heal our local ecosystems, they're all about qualitative changes. And if we try to capture those qualitative changes in quantities, we lose a lot. But again,
yeah, although I think, Daniel, one thing to keep in mind, to be honest, is that there would be quantifiable aspects that one could look at. For instance, the degree of pollution in the air, the degree of pollution in the water, the actual, quality of as I say, the air pollution, the water pollution, how much green they have around them. So there would be quantifiable elements that I think we should also be sure to mention and to insist on. Yeah. Because it's a very selective focus in terms of quantification. And don't forget, the whole thing is run on a system that commercializes every aspect of life. So the various interconnected webs of life are being intervened in at every stage to create, a profit for extractive capitalism. And so it's sort of an insanity in a way that any of us are actually allowing GDP as a measure to continue. Once you've understood that it really does increase with pollution, with ill health. By the way, that would be another indicator that could be used, is actual health, including looking honestly at obesity and its link to sugar. Again, that the actual diet, what are people getting in their diet? What types of food cost less money? What types of food cost more money? Could get lots of numbers there too. And we'll see this dreadful reality that around the world, processed old food from far away will cost much less than fresh, healthy, organic food. Why? Because of an economic system that selectively, looks at numbers in an extremely blind and destructive way.
But how come, like, if we both have experienced a shift, at least in the conversation over the last 10, 15, 20 years, both with regard to the need to redesign the economic system and with the critique on GDP, it's also very popular now to admit that it's an inadequate measure. But then so many wonderful people have done so much wonderful work over the last 15, 20 years trying to build alternative indicator, and there's a whole host of them. And why aren't we shifting? Like,
well, I guess I think, as you probably know, I've been dealing with this extremely sensitive and difficult issue, and that is the way that so-called free trade treaties have actually been about deregulating global economic activity. So deregulating global finance, global corporate activity, global media, pharmaceutical industry, seed companies, fossil fuel industry. The global operators, which are generally transnational or multinational mobile corporations, have been asking for more and more freedom from regulation. And so these treaties that to the general public look like something beneficial or neutral or have actually been an extremely destructive process whereby governments have progressively given these giants, the Exxons, the Monsantos, the large banks, more and more freedom. And I think particularly after 2008, when everyone in the world knew what is going on in this finance world with these trade in mortgages of lives of people you've never seen and completely irresponsible behavior. The whole world knew that we needed to regulate the banks. But tragically, instead, what's happened is further deregulation. However, this whole issue of the way that these giants have been given more freedom and totally removed from regulation, while at the same time pressuring governments to increase the spending on global infrastructure that favors them and makes them richer. And they have also, together with governments, been part of encouraging more and more regulation at the local, regional, and national level. Yeah. So even national industries are place-based, they're scrutinized to some extent, and they have met with regulations, and particularly the small players, particularly small farmers, small primary producers have been burdened with more and more heavy regulation. And these same place-based businesses at the national level have been squeezed for taxes. In the meanwhile, those taxes are used to subsidize an infrastructure and generally business as usual for giant global corporations. So we have a completely unfair playing field, which around the world, and I don't know of any country virtually that hasn't gone along with this, we have this situation where those that use the most energy, pollute the most, are most resource intensive, and it actually overall employ fewer people. That these entities have grown in power, and worldwide, as I said earlier, we're seeing in reality a situation that even during periods of growth, national GDP increasing, the majority of people are getting poorer.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I believe that once this sort of genie really gets out of the bottle, there could be a huge aha experience for the movements, the social and environmental movements, but also for political and economic leaders. But we need to do everything we can to spell this out in a clear way, in a compassionate way. It really is primarily about blindness. We're allowing many leaders to comfortably remain blind. But, I would say at the level of, social and environmental movements really haven't done the job because we've not been looking globally enough. There's been very little awareness of how enormous and fundamentally important this trajectory has been over the last 30 years, not only taking us into a world of far greater increases in pollution and CO2 emission, but also a situation where most people now have lost all faith in democracy. They're basically seeing their governments promise till they're blue in the face as they seek election to look after their citizens. And once in power, they're looking after global billionaires. So we have a big job to do to get this holistic message out. And without demonizing, without assuming that either any individual corporation is to blame or any in particular individuals, I really do feel that this should be done with a great deal of compassion and understanding that as long as the whole world remains blind, well, this casino economy will continue, and we really need to urgently get on with this task to expose the realities of it.
So how would you, because I think we're both very much aligned with this need for working locally in the sense of that really it is all about re-localizing and re-regionalizing. But in order to achieve that, we need increased global collaboration among all the actors to clear the playing field. Because as you alluded to, right now, anybody, like my example here on the island of Mallorca, even if we all agreed and tried to build a example of a regional economy at island scale to increase local food production, local food sovereignty, to manage our water here on the island in a way that is sensible and that people have ownership over, to produce decentralized renewable energy and create a transport system that is based on public transport and non-polluting. All of those shifts would actually run against global regulations and would compete in an unfair market with cheap imports from afar. So where do you see the key entry points? Like if you said, talk to Joseph Stiglitz and people at the IMF and the WTO, what would be your message to them of saying, these are the 4 or 5 key leverage points in terms of externalities and subsidies where we could really shift the system and enable people to have a more regionalized, relocalized livelihood?
Again, you know, talking to those in power, I would be looking at the urgent need to renegotiate trade treaties, to start a process of re-regulation at the global level. And this will happen once governments really are held to account by their citizens. You know, because as individuals in government, you know, you often have this revolving door where they will, you know, as an MP later on become CEO of big corporations. So at a personal level, there are certain vested interests in just continuing business as usual. But at the national level and, you know, at the level of civic society, we really must insist on a process of re-regulation, and it's not something that's going to suddenly overnight close down every multinational company, but the end goal would be that society shapes business rather than business as it is currently doing now, shaping society and shaping a sort of a democracy, which is not democracy at all. When you have global media having such influence in national debates, even forgetting about the lobbying and the funds that are directly used to manipulate the government process, the lack of control of media and so on is also a fundamental part of it. And that, again, we as civic society members, we don't want to leave that control entirely to centralized governments. We want to see civic society at the table and part of the process of shaping the new agenda. But I mean, for people in power, you know, the need to start re-regulating the banks and corporations is something that, you know, we can give them a lot of evidence as to why that is necessary. And equally important is to look at systematically deregulating at the local and national level. Of course, selectively, not across the board. We want certain genuine environmental protection. We want genuine concern for public health and safety. But what we have found in working across the world in the local, trying to build up local food economies, is that the best people to monitor, you know, what kind of seeds, what kind of hygiene standards are necessary on their farms, in the processing industry, in the restaurant, would best be monitored and controlled by local groups. Because even things like the centralized national organic standard ends up incapable of actually taking responsibility for what's happening at a distance. So we need, you know, to understand the need for more experiential knowledge and more localized ways of monitoring, and they ideally will be part of a tiered system where this also extends up to the global level, and in both direction, you know, from the local to the global, from the global to local, accountability and visibility.
But when you say the need to re-regulate, the key, like, I mean, we're currently still in a world where, despite more governments committing verbally to taking action on climate change, off the top of my head, something like 70 or more % of global energy subsidies are still subsidizing fossil fuel industry, and then there's another 10 or 15 that subsidize nuclear, and renewables still get a very small part of the energy subsidy pie. Similarly, we still have conditions where kerosene for flights isn't taxed properly, where the most polluting of all fossil fuels, the bunker oil of large ships, is not regulated in a proper way. So what specific entry points for re-regulations would you give priority if you said, like, these are the 5 that we really need to get going on?
Well, I think if we, in order to do any of them, I don't think any of them would be easier to implement than the re-regulation of global trade. But certainly one of the things that has to be looked at is the fact that right now every business, and these are operating at the national level because the other ones are completely deregulated, but at the national level, they're all being encouraged to use energy and technology instead of employing people, because it's been fundamental to the modern economy to do so. And because there was a belief that technology will always alleviate hard work, and there was this vision of us not having to do any work, and so it's gone unabated from the beginnings of the modern economy, shifting that to encourage businesses instead to employ people wherever possible and wherever desirable. Because there are instances, yes, where technology can be a benefit, but once we start looking holistically and we understand the reality of smaller scale diversified farms, for instance, being one of the most attractive places for people to work. So there are several examples of billionaires who choose to leave their Silicon Valley jobs or whatever they might have been, to farming on a diversified scale and with the appropriate number of people to areas of land or animals is one of the more enjoyable things that we can do. It's something that's in our DNA. We were connected to that, and this was part of our lives for our whole evolution. So I'm seeing one of the most inspiring movements of all is this sort of new farmers movement. But anyway, shifting away from encouraging every business to use ever more energy and technology instead of employing people would be one of the most important things we could do. Right now, we don't, because we're not looking at the economic trajectory, we're not understanding why most teachers are now so burdened with bureaucracy, they barely have time to spend on the students. Most doctors are sitting looking at their computer screen instead of their patients. And whether teachers or doctors, they all have less time to do what they're meant to be doing. Why? It's because of centralized system, using the computer industry and a tool that seemed to be, for many people, seemed to be a great advantage. It has allowed for this centralized control and power and the management of more and more people at distance. And it has led to this terrible time pressure, competition, and not only energy intensive technologies, but we're talking now about technologies that use more and more rare earth minerals and very, very scary trajectory. I guess you've heard about mining the Mediterranean for the minerals needed for electric cars. We have not had an honest full cost accounting of these technological systems that have been presented to us, particularly in the last 30, 40 years, as huge advances for humankind. And now we need to start looking really honestly at the rare earth minerals, at the resources, the energy, and what it's doing to society. So that would be one intervention. One of the most important also would be to immediately moving away from what we call insane trade. Because we have these inbuilt mechanisms that favor energy use instead of human labor. We have this situation where supermarkets routinely fly fish to the other side of the world to be deboned, fly back, apples to be washed, flown back again. I had my eyes open to this first in Sweden in the 70s. And it was because I'd become aware of this through work in Ladakh and Bhutan, in these ancient cultures that still had their own local economy. And then I saw the advent of the outside economy and how it created unemployment and pollution overnight. And I saw how suddenly butter traveling from the other side of the Himalayas, more than a week's travel, and it arrives in the local marketplace and sells for half the price of butter from a 5-minute walk away from the farm. So that opened my eyes to it. I go back to Sweden, and I find that at that time in the 70s, they were sending potatoes by road to Italy to be washed, put in plastic bags, and sent back again by road. Now this is happening by air, and it's happening across the world.
Yes.
And equally idiotic and criminally wasteful is that because of the whole nature of this deregulated global system, favoring the multinationals, countries are choosing, instead of using their own food to feed their people, their own building materials, their own fibers for all the basic needs, they are importing and exporting the same product. You see, if everybody sat down tomorrow and ate their breakfast from food that had been grown and processed and sold in their own country, no multinational would make money. But because of the craziness of favoring global trade, countries now routinely import and export beef, wheat, milk, water. Right now, the UK exports 20 tons of bottled water to Australia. Australia exports 20 tons of bottled water to the UK. And what is almost enough to drive me mad is that we've tried to raise awareness about this for a long time. And sadly, not even most climate groups bring this up. Instead, they go along with an agenda that blames the individual and that creates so much self-blame and despair. I think if people could have their eyes open to what's going on, they would feel a great sense of relief and hopefully join, what I call big picture activism.
So how do you, because on the one hand, we have these massive changes that are necessary at the regulatory level of how we deal with things globally, but then there's this massive potential of re-energizing and revitalizing local community and networks of local communities within their bioregion or at the regional scale. And the very often quoted Buckminster Fuller quote, "Don't fight the existing system, build an alternative one that makes the old one obsolete." It probably is a little bit of both, and we need to lobby at the global level to change these regulations. But where do you see hope, like particularly with regard to your new book, Local is Our Future? Where do you see the opportunity in the meantime, as we're trying to lobby changes at international level and national level, for people to really take back the power at the local level and strengthen local economies and strengthen local food sovereignty and all those aspects? You name a number in your book, but I'd love to hear from you directly.
Yeah, as you know, I was one of the co-founders of both the Global Eco-Village Network and the education process in the Eco-Village Network. And so for me, for 45 years, it was very clear that so many benefits would come from stronger local economies, including eco-villages where possible. But I guess for me, it was clear that for so many people, that would be a rather difficult task. And so I felt that the broader process of localization is what many people could and should engage in. So we're trying to encourage people to start the process of reconnecting consumers, producers, and the middlemen. It's not a question of getting rid of the middleman. We have many examples where local farmers selling to a local shop that in turn sells to local consumers can work extremely well. And we have a lot of examples of also more direct relationships through farmers markets. There are now more and more projects which we feel, for us having helped to catalyze these initiatives in so many countries, we are just amazed and thrilled to see that they are flourishing and they are continuing to grow. So we see this as a vitally important focus for most people who today are feeling overwhelmed, who feel depressed about Madrid, what just happened in Madrid. I would urge them to also look at our website as well as my book, to see examples of the sort of initiatives that they can maybe join or start. Once you get a different set of lenses on and you realize the importance of this shortening of distances as a counterweight to what's been going on with these heavy subsidies and so on, once you start putting those lenses on, you'll see there's so much more happening than you would have thought. And I hope you'll join me in feeling deeply encouraged by a fundamentally different narrative from the dominant one. The dominant narrative is that this is mess that we have, the xenophobia, the anti-immigrant feeling, the climate change, the mountains of plastic, the pesticides, the disappearance of insects. You know, it just feels like an endless string of dreadful, frightening crises. Once we start realizing that they emanate from the same economic fundamentals, and we see that the shortening of distances is a systemic antidote. You know, particularly if you join the local food movement, you will be helping to restore not only wildlife, you'll be helping to renew the water sources, you'll be helping to reduce the need for energy, you'll be helping structurally to stimulate market pressure that in turn stimulates the producers towards diversity. And diversity is a fundamental principle of life. So this is why these local food initiatives are so much more important than many people realize. But I do absolutely feel that there's so much that we can do that is very real, that's very significant. And it's about changing the I to a we. We're becoming part of a systemic collective shift, a community initiative, instead of just saying, okay, I'm going to shop local. We're wanting you to actually be part of this sort of movement and really help to strengthen and join and grow that local food movement. But along with that, now there are more and more initiatives that build on that foundation, and local business alliances are being formed, local finance schemes, local energy as well, community energy initiatives. Most of it on a human scale that provides the structures that allow us to be far more intelligent, far more wise in our choices. We're seeing the structures in a way that prevents the very dangerous manipulation that's going on in the global economy, where we've been led to believe that, you know, buying that new eco product, or, well, there are many things we've been led to believe, you know, that if we drive our car less and if we don't go on holiday in an airplane, that's how we're going to solve the climate crisis. But these things were all misleading, and they were not looking at the real issues or what was happening to the economy in terms of what industry was doing and what type of business and industry our governments were promoting. I do want to say, though, Daniel, I want to make it clearer, and I find it very difficult to really stress this enough somehow. I'm not talking about us also lobbying government. I'm talking about encouraging people to start joining and creating localization initiatives with a very big focus on food and farming. And with that, agroforestry, so also trees, which are an important part of it, and including animals as part of diversified systems. That, if you study that more, you'll see that this is a way of regenerating and healing the earth. But in terms of changing the bigger trajectory and what governments do, I'm talking more about something along the lines of Extinction Rebellion, that we need to have civic society at the table. We are not just going to be lobbying existing politicians and government. We are going to build up a movement that demands civic society involvement, and that will probably mean, in many cases, a change in government. It will mean we need to be put in place a new politics, a new framing that is linked to the new economy understanding. And in some places that's starting to happen. And, particularly at the local level, there are very interesting political changes. For instance, Froome, I'm sure you've heard of the independence for Froome in England, a very exciting initiative where all the representatives went away from party politics to represent their local community. And with that, we're able to do very creative, very positive things with a very limited budget. So we need to essentially recapture democracy. It's not just about lobbying government. And the first step is to create more awareness in the movements, the social and environmental movement. And one of the first steps there is to move away from a single issue focus. We have to have a flag that clearly says to people, this is not just about climate as an issue out there. This is about your livelihood. It's about your child's potential for some kind of secure livelihood. It's about some kind of culture and way of life that provides security and that moves you away from this intensely competitive, unstable system to create more secure and balanced relationships.
But how, you mentioned Extinction Rebellion, and I mean, that's one of the big hopeful shifts of the last, even really the last year or 14 months, with Extinction Rebellion and Fridays for Future somehow activating a lot more people into this discourse. And at the same time, it is very focused on the climate change issue, and it is very focused on a kind of enough, we don't want any more of this, we have a right to a future. To my mind, I haven't seen enough yet the shift of the people who've now been activated into the hopeful local regional movements of saying, let's begin to build the new system that makes the old obsolete. Let's claim our right to civic participation in governance and politics at the local level, and then link up globally to also claim it at the global level. But it's this shift from being against something to a concerted strategy of putting something new into place that need to activate.
But I would say that actually, where I slightly differ with you, I worry a little bit about the idea that many people now have as they get interested in localization. And so then they think, let's first build up the local and then let's look at linking up and changing the bigger system. I am trying to urge people to do both. Not every person necessarily, but we're trying to urge people to get together in local groups and there jointly look at what can we do as a community initiative, and also how can we contribute to getting the word out about the reality of lots of local examples that show that we must go local for the future. The imperative has to do with biodiversity. There's an imperative there that we just can't escape. It's about what actually can be life enhancing and how that relates to local knowledge systems. It relates to experiential knowledge. There's multiple reasons why we're going to have to go local. We may end up doing that just through crises, but thank goodness there are a lot of initiatives that are happening without absolute necessity. But I am trying to encourage people to simultaneously, at least as a group, or at least be linked to groups that are trying to get the word out about the localizing path as a strategy for a political shift. And so it's a little bit like, many spiritual movements thought, first we have to have peace on the inside, and then we can create a peace movement. What I've always been saying is the inner and the outer are completely connected. We're going to be much better off if we start at both ends. And for instance, in terms of inner transformation, I love to use this PRISM project near us in Devon, where prisoners who their whole lives have been hardened and only known anger and been in a competitive culture, helped to basically build a sense of connection and community, to sit down and have a conversation over a meal in a way that they've never done. A prisoner will say, I've never in my life experienced people actually talking to me and being interested in what I was feeling or thinking. And these same prisoners have gained that sense of community also through growing food and learning that skill and learning the joy of being really productive and seeing the results in a deep, ultimately spiritual connection to the living world. So things like that can transform people on the inside, but it starts with, as it were, an external localization project. So I feel, I also feel that with Extinction Rebellion, that they are beginning now to change. And I agree with you, it should be in two directions. One of them is to understand and embrace the localization movement. The other one is to put out a message to people that is beyond just climate, that is saying, we are not just about climate over here, we are about an economic transformation that is about your livelihood. This is not something that's separate from you. So I think that message of the new economy movement and the potential through localization, the potential particularly with policy change, how really quite rapidly we could see huge benefits if we were able to get more support from the dominant system. So we are seeing some local governments and some regional governments now, beginning to change. And it's very interesting because it's so clearly because they're pressured, they're closer to the ground, they're often more aware of the environmental impact, they're more aware of the social impact of what they do. And so they are responding earlier than national governments. I'm quite convinced that if we have time, that we will ultimately move in the right direction. What worries me is that there's this juggernaut of, basically fake capital created through debt and just out of thin air, not linked to any resources, not linked to any real wealth, but just because we've allowed the banks to become so powerful, the global banks, they're able to create masses of money which is used almost like bombs, landing in local and national economies, pushing everything in the direction of exploitation, pollution, etc. So that creates an urgency that means I think we need to try to get what I call the big picture out as soon as possible.
Well, let me just briefly get back to, I wasn't in any way suggesting we need to first do this and then do the other. And also, everything you've just said, I've also been working on for 20 years, that we need to work on both ends at the same time.
Good.
But for me, the issue with, you mentioned diversity as one of the key measures of a healthy system. One thing that I was slightly disappointed with regard to Extinction Rebellion is, they have these 10 principles, and one of the principles is regenerative culture. We need a regenerative culture, and then the subline says creating cultures that are healthy, resilient, and adaptable. And that subline proves to me that they've actually taken this from my book, because it's exactly those three adjectives that I use in that sequence. But what they didn't do, and this is I'm excited, and it's not about kind of some author having some sort of quibbles that they didn't quote me, but I'm excited that they picked it up. But what I'm worried about is that they turned the plural of regenerative cultures into a singular. Because for me, this is one of these issues that slightly, because it came out of the UK and there's wonderful people involved, and I'm so glad Extinction Rebellion exists, and I'm fully supportive of them. And there is yet again, by using this singular, we're yet again not decolonializing the mind enough, and we're pretending that it's a bunch of English activists who've created the new thing that now everybody has to take on, instead of saying, no, regeneration and coming back to this wealth and the potential of local community and local ecosystems to provide for nature and us as part of nature is all about the biocultural uniqueness of place. It's all about these regenerative cultures in all their diversity, giving expression to a healthy system. And if just let me one little bit more of that rant and I hand over to you. It's also about this, that when we understand that it is about creating many of these diverse regenerative cultures in place, then we can also see that in all our diversity of faith, of religious beliefs, because we don't have enough time to get to a point where all of humanity agrees on what to do. We will need to begin to re-treasure our diversity of opinion also as part of life's diversity of adaptability, and yet find that higher ground of working in the same direction to heal the planet and heal our relationship with each other and the planet. And so I'd love to just hear your perspective on that.
Well, I love the fact that you say that plural, and I have to tell you, there are very few Westerners who understand that. So I have felt in that, because I've been at it for 45 years, and that's been it's a big, big problem, particularly in the Anglo world, always lack of awareness, but even generally in Europe, too little understanding of the need for plural there, for the diversity of cultures, and particularly that deep connection between people and the place, the natural place where they live and that they emanate from. So, and that's of course fundamental to localization. That's why localization is so fundamental, and why even knowledge systems need to be decentralized. And then you get into a whole discussion about the role of science today. And again, why the latest techno systems have to be questioned, because they tend to suit global centralized power structures. And that's another whole discussion we probably don't want to get into now, but it is certainly something we need to be discussing and people need to be thinking about. And I feel, to me, it's so much about awareness of this bigger picture. It's a real wake up that can be helped when people like us try to put out this bigger picture. And at the same time, I see there's some, as people quite intuitively react to the problems of the toxic monoculture, the consumer monoculture, in many ways, they are returning to place. They're returning. It happens in many different ways, but even in starting to listen to their bodies, they start listening more to their bodies. And as you know, they often know much better than the over-intellectualized mind. So there is a way in which I think that humankind would come back to diversity and place, and a deep wisdom, and a joyous connection to life itself. And it is doing that. It's just that we need to help try to speed up the process, because this truly artificial, man-made juggernaut, which is a techno-economic system that's taken on a life of its own, that now literally is run by algorithms, by robots. It's a very, very dangerous system, is escalating. And that system may be the very last thing to collapse. So we should not wait for that system to collapse, and as many people do, believe that it will, because we might very well have another 2008, 2009, but that doesn't mean the system collapses, because it'll be fixed in the same way it was fixed before, if we the people and we the movements don't wake up.
But how do you deal with, because there's one, we mentioned, there's two more things that I'd like to address before we wrap up. One of them is the danger that I've observed in recent years, that what has become possible now is that I certainly have found myself in the conversation at a local level with people that all seem to initially agree, yes, we need to build food sovereignty, we need to meet most of our communities' essential needs closer to home, we need to value our local ecosystems and our local culture more, all stuff that I would immediately sign on the dotted line for. And then suddenly other little bits of the discourse come in, and you realize you're actually talking to relatively right-wing relocalization groups that are coming at a similar agenda, but from a very, very different angle that is kind of against an other and is actually quite xenophobic. And like you could find right-wing German Nazis supporting a relocalization agenda. You can find extremist Catalan independence movement people that are doing wonderful work, but doing it as an opposition to another. Jump on that bandwagon. Have you come across this tension yourself, and how do we work with that?
Well, I have. I mean, but I must say, what I've come across much more is people on the left assuming that localization looks like that. I'm trying to think if I've known any people who are really truly on a localization agenda. Now, remember, particularly around food, we are talking about becoming self-reliant. We're not talking about having a nice farmers market to add to everything else that you can import. And so I don't think I've actually met right-wing people who are actually truly on the localization agenda. As I say, they might have liked the addition of a nice farmers market or something. So, and I think the fear on the left is very much a fear of that the assumption is that if you care about the local, that you're then, going to be anti the outside. Where I think we have a lot to talk about is the role of tourism and even to some extent immigration in threatening local communities and their ability to look after themselves. So I've tried for years to explain that I've seen Irish furious at Americans who were coming in large numbers and buying up their villages. I've seen Swedes, angry at the Germans. I've seen Welsh people burning the houses of Londoners that were moving into Wales and buying up houses. So I think we've got to look there at the need for communities everywhere to have more control over their lives, and at probably quite a natural reaction when local communities feel overwhelmed and marginalized by outside forces. Now, when it comes to immigrants, and so much of that is exacerbated by, again, media and other outside interests in saying that your problem is due to the immigrants, and people then assume that their hardship is due to that. So it's, for me, the clarity about why most communities are feeling disempowered and marginalized, the clarity about, even with tourism, now in Venice, I think they have something like 50 million tourists a year, and there have been anti-tourist demonstrations. Well, this is a consequence, again, of this economic system that is extracting wealth out of every local community. So from my point of view, having a vision of localization, which is completely about the message that the human race should have the right to feed itself, local communities should have the right to provide food for themselves first and not be forced into this trade relationship, which started with slavery. It started with colonialism, and it created these huge imbalances that this system has fed off, and through that created a lot of anger and inequality that is not of localization as a problem, but of globalization as the problem.
You gave a really good keyword there with slavery, because in many ways, economic globalization has been a second round of colonialization, of putting the system in place. I mean, I don't know if I just recently saw this movie, The Spider's Web, that looked at the British. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. It looks at how basically after the fall of the British Empire, the city of London, with its peculiar, strange historic that goes back to 1066 or 1067, where the city of London got this new, like special deal of being separate from the rest of the UK with regard to certain levels of regulations. But really, very much since the fall of the British Empire after the Second World War, there was an active move by the power elites in the UK to create a new system of control that was based on the financial markets. And when you mentioned migration, my mind also went to, we need to, in this global awareness raising, we need to also understand that most of these migrations we now observe are really triggered by colonialism and the second wave of colonialism, like either the environmentally driven migrations or the socially or even the economically driven migrations are all addressing the imbalance that we've created between the global north and the global south. And so either we address our historical debt and we cancel the debt of the global south, and we stop this conversation of, oh, will support you when you because the sad and tragic aspect of all this is that, having been raped and pillaged twice by colonialism and then neoliberal economic globalization, now climate change is hitting those global south nations and low-lying islands in the Pacific and in the Caribbean much harder than the wealthy extractive northern powers that have benefited twice from this extractive.
Yeah, although actually, I mean, interestingly enough, I think that is not necessarily true now. If you look at what's happened in California and you look at what's happening in Australia.
It's beginning to hit closer to home as well. But it doesn't mean it's not hitting India and Africa. And so how do we address this global imbalance of the past wrongdoings in order to actually move forward together as one humanity? Because we've
well, that to me, what's very important there is not to blame the current generation of white people for what their ancestors did, nor even to glorify the current generation of people from the global south or indigenous people that are no longer, living in an indigenous way. Let's try to really shift away from the politics of identity. And let's look at how we're trying to work for a system that is truly more just and equitable, and how actually, I think there's a very important task to be done, which is to show that now the suffering in both the industrialized countries and in the less industrialized countries is such that in many ways, those people in the global south or in the so-called undeveloped world that have not yet been pulled into cities are in many ways better off than many of us. They have more skills, they have more ability to provide for themselves, and they are actually leaders in trying to build more localized economies that serve their own needs. What's preventing it is huge psychological pressures, as well as government pressures, as well as regulations that are trying to destroy that self-reliance and trying to destroy those regional economies. But we should be very aware that it's extremely important for us to have a deep dialogue between the most urbanized, industrialized parts of the world and, as it were, the least industrialized and urbanized, and to try to show that they should not feel as they are made to feel every day through school books, through television, through films, through adverts. They are told that they are stupid and backward and know nothing and are nobody. And so there's a huge psychological pressure on them to want to emulate the urban consumer culture. And as I said earlier, in most cases, as they move into the cities, which, as you know, many of which are, 20 million, 40 million. Beijing is actually 60 million now with 18 satellite cities. They're absolute nightmare. So huge amount of work needed to communicate more deeply. And I would say now move beyond also the discourse of rich country, poor country, which is particularly misleading when it comes to the climate debate, because we were told that poor countries shouldn't lower emissions as fast as rich countries. And that was because industry was moving from Europe and North America into the poor countries to use the poor labor and then to transport things even more and create even more poverty on the other
and
side.
externalize pollution to have better environmental records in the north because heavy production is in the south. But all of this still, and this is the last point that I, because I know that you worked with Noam Chomsky in early days of your career, and I, recently, because we also mentioned the media earlier and the role of the media, recently I came across somebody mentioned to me that Marshall McLuhan apparently at one point said that the trend of globalization of media would inevitably lead in the future to a renaissance of the local, and I'm wondering to what extent, when we look at building alliances at local and regional level, and we want to create new participatory civic democracy movements, there is this issue that because our education systems, and particularly the media, have brainwashed a large part of humanity into believing this growth imperative and this progress story, and have inoculated us with this highly competitive, misunderstood Darwinism of competition and so on. Like when you actually get to a point of saying, no, we all should have more of a say and hear everybody's voice, the voices you hear are feeding back the results of pretty bad media work and education work of 30, 40 years. So when you then do these multi-stakeholder, multi-actor collaborations, you're actually hearing a lot of misinformation in the room. And it's kind of a, like when you look at the history of kind of referendums and participatory democracy, very often demagogues have got into power because of that. Yeah? And so it's this, for me, there's a big tension of, not ideologically, but idealistically, I would love for all of us to sit in a circle and make decisions that hear everybody's voice. And every time I've actually done it with a very diverse group and not a pre-selected group of my type of people, I very quickly got frustrated with the amount of ignorance in the room that is based on this mediatic and bad education manipulation of 30 years of telling the wrong story. So how do you see that tension working out as we try to build a better future?
Well, I mean, one thing I think that we need to be very clear about is that, again, through very sophisticated think tanks using billions of dollars, the pressure on the movements in the West have been, are you democratic? Do you have a completely level consensus, structure in your movement, in your NGO? And we don't realize that we're being told to be the perfect democracy inside a system that is pressuring us every day to just survive, to pay the mortgage, to pay the rent. So we're in a system that is fundamentally hierarchical and every day exerting more pressure. So we have to be very, very aware of what is actually going on here. We're actually being manipulated into a supposed, perfect democratic structure, which from my experience has never existed ever. Mm-hmm. I feel there's a lot to learn from indigenous cultures, as I did in Ladakh and Bhutan. And there was very, very clear ways that everyone did not have exactly the same voice, and particularly, that the elders knew better. They were very lucky, they were living in structures where things had been tested and tried for generations. So for most things, there wasn't even a need for a discussion. Mm. And when there was, there were people who were clearly looked up to. And so let's be a bit careful here, and let's try to to realize that we cannot create the change we need to see by trying to be, as I say, this completely level consensus-making structure.
Mm-hmm.
To me, does not make sense.
Mm-hmm.
However, having said that, I think that, of course, we want to move in a much more democratic direction as we're trying to create these new models and these new ways of living. But the interesting thing for me is that in the localization movement, particularly again around food, but also with the business alliances, so we've actually succeeded in finding a way of beginning to build structures where people become interdependent, coming from very different places.
Mm-hmm.
So typically the local food initiatives like farmers markets are started using the conventional currency. Very often the farmers are quite conservative, if not right-wing, and they've been trained to believe that I've got to go in this direction towards chemicals and monoculture. In many cases, when they started joining the farmers market, it was because they were struggling so badly, and someone had the idea, let's try to do a local market. And I've had the great joy of seeing how they suddenly find themselves in this new structure where the consumer doesn't mind if there's some specks on the apples. They absolutely don't want every apple or avocado to be exactly the same size. So there is this sudden newly formed relationship and dialogue between more greeny, lefty, if you like, and more conservative. And in the meanwhile, they don't have to sit around as part of a
Mm-hmm.
consensus-making stakeholder situation
Mm-hmm.
that to a great extent, as I say, has been imposed on us by vested interests.
Mm-hmm. So to wrap up, I just want to bring attention back to your book, and
Thank you.
do you want to just briefly, like, one thing that I would love to hear is at the very end, the last chapter of the book is a conversation you just had not so long ago with one of the great elders of the movement, and particularly the need to come back to the land and to re-engage with agriculture in a way that allows us to really put humanity back into nature as gardeners of landscape, as protectors of landscape. So can you just off memory maybe pull out a couple of highlights of that conversation with Wendell Berry? And if there's anything else you want to say about the book and how to engage with your work more deeply, it would be useful to share that with listeners.
Oh, well, I've known Wendell for a very long time. He's on our advisory board, and he's been one of the soulmates. One thing I think in our conversation, even now, where we differ a little bit, is that he hasn't been involved globally, the way I have. And so I used to slightly argue with him because he would say, no, only think locally and act locally. And I was saying, but on the other side of the world, I'm seeing people who don't know anything about what's happening here being very misled about what we're up to, and the other way around. And this is feeding into this global system. So so that's partly, so that's where we have a slightly different point of view. But he is, of course, one of the absolute sort of pioneers and leaders of the localization movement. And it's just so thrilling to know that he's still healthily and happily actually farming at his age, and he's has got a great sense of humor, and he's an excellent writer. So I really recommend him if people haven't read his essays and books. A wonderful writer, and so he's been a huge gift to the movement, and it's thrilling to see that he's very respected in thoughtful circles in America. Very, very wonderful. And in terms of the book in general, yeah, it is different in that way. And it's in my sort of, problem is that I'm trying to say something and to do something that is extremely unusual. I mean, I would say unique. I don't know of anyone, any other voice or any other organization that has been promoting localization from a global perspective, from global experience, and for a global movement. And this has also led to what some people might think of as hypocrisy, that we end up in my tiny organization organizing conferences in several different countries and several different continents, and that we actually believe that people who want to try to understand what's happening in the world and want to really do something to contribute, we would actually urge them, if possible, to spend some time in both the least developed parts of the world and the most developed, because that's, I think, where you get sort of a clarity about the system at work in terms of, yeah, I feel like I'm working with two invisibilities, two invisible worlds. I'm working with the hand of the economy, you know, the invisible hand of the economy, which has become a completely global economy. And very, very few activist organizations have been focusing on that global system and its global impact. It's very difficult to focus on its global impact when you're only in one place. And so I've seen that invisible hand of the economy, the proponents of it, often have a lot of global experience and are moving around globally, be they diplomats, be they heads of business, or whatever. But they're looking at it through that lens of numbers and absolutely wedded to their assumptions about growth. On the other hand, I'm dealing with another invisibility, which is the inner workings of our deep spiritual, emotional, psychological, even physical connection to the living world, the world within us, the world, the natural world that we are deeply connected to. And I believe that we long to come home to. We have been cut off and separated from the natural world, and, you know, sort of images, you know, in a high-rise building and with windows you can't open, no sign of nature around you, controlled environment. We have ended up sick, lonely, and longing to come back home. And that journey back home is about rebuilding these invisible connections that give us a deep sense of satisfaction and meaning. And I feel, you know, very lucky to be inviting people to what I call the economics of happiness. But it's not so much about the economics of happiness, it really is about understanding this man-made artificial system absolutely pumped up by fossil fuels, those high-rise buildings, all the materials, that industrial food never would have been possible without fossil fuels. And we are now beginning to count the cost on every level. That man-made system is the economics of deep unhappiness and deep ill health, physical ill health, mounting day by day, from diabetes to heart disease to terrible also mental illness, anxiety, depression, suicide among young people. So really what we're talking about is the economics of unhappiness versus cultures of happiness. We're talking about moving towards cultures of connection, deep interdependence, and it might all sound a bit exaggerated and romantic, but I have to say that I see on a daily basis evidence of how that coming home and that reconnection really does make people happier and healthier. It's just
I mean, that's
so wonderful.
That's where our work completely aligns. I mean, the whole notion of regenerative cultures and bringing culture to the foreground again, healing cultures, and reconnecting with our ability as nature to be a healing influence in the ecosystems we inhabit, to undo the damage that we've done for centuries and millennia. That's really, I see so many people around the world waking up to that message, and there's a real, like I like to call it the regeneration rising, like playing with the generation as a generation that regenerates. And it's a call that people really are resonating with. There's a young Australian filmmaker who just made a documentary called 2040 that has the subtitle "Join the Regeneration." And
he's a close friend of mine. He's a close friend of mine, and he'll be at the conference in Ibiza. So you know, the also what also, again, what I said earlier, you know, and I'm sure you agree, is that in the dominant narrative, people who are not in any way connected to this movement, they're being told the opposite and they feel it. They're saying the human race is like a cancer and I really, you know, we deserve to extinguish ourselves. And the fact that we actually need people on the land and that on this crowded planet where so much damage has been inflicted by this system, we actually need more people to care for every tree, for every earthworm, for that regeneration.
Yeah.
And so once people connect to that and are part of some kind of productive, meaningful activity in that, it is, yeah, at every level, deeply joyful. And I'm so glad that you're a colleague in this. And thank you so much for doing this, Dan.
You've been such an inspiration for so many years, and also for me, you continue to be an inspiration in the sense that you have been so true to your message. I like you just, the world's catching up, I find, but you have been doing this for much longer than many, and often not with getting enough of the recognition. I still believe that there wouldn't be in every Tesco in the country of the UK, there wouldn't be food mileage stickers if you and Isaac hadn't started conversations about the power of local food and distinguishing that actually local can be even more important than certified organic, and those kind of conversations. I personally believe that you've been very influential in taking that out to a lot of people who now use that language but have no idea that it came from impulses that your organization sent.
Thank you so much for recognizing that, because we also haven't done very much to promote ourselves. So
no,
I'm glad that you've seen it.
It's been an absolute pleasure. And maybe the one final question would be, despite everything, would you say you're still hopeful for, because the last year has brought this, particularly around climate change, a kind of strange shift from arguing whether climate change was as important as some people or we all believe it is, to suddenly people saying, well, it's all too late, and doom and gloom and extinction and collapse is near and all that. Where do you position yourself in this dynamic where we can embrace collapse of a system that no longer serves, but still be hopeful that we can turn the corner of becoming healers again and building a future for all of life and for humanity?
Yes, no, I mean, I definitely feel there is hope. As I say, I'm worried that this dominant system can continue to escalate and create a lot of damage. I see a certain sense of urgency in getting the word out and helping people make that transition into being part of this new movement, which I do see as a global movement in a way, even though it consists of a multitude of different cultures and peoples. So I think that it's wonderful to know that what we can do right now that will make our lives happier and healthier is what we need to do for the long term.
Yeah.
And let's not dwell too much in the distant future or even in tomorrow, because we've learned that really living in the present and doing what we know is right is what makes us happy and what will make us glow. So once we learn those deeper spiritual lessons of being in the present and doing what we know is right, we're on a path that is a winner, however we look at it.
Absolutely, yeah. It's the doing will change as we change the being. Coming back into the present that is the presence, and acting from that joy of connecting with people and place. I come back to that a lot, that the pathway to make it through the eye of the needle in the face of adversity, and the pathway to building the resilience towards the calamities that might still come, is one and the same pathway. And in doing so, we can be healthier and happier and more meaningful. And that's really the message we need to make people come back to. So thank you so much for this time. I'm just going to stop the recording now.
Thank you.
And
so I also just wanted to ask you, have you had any more contact with Alan?